our jobs numbers, the White House is touting them as some sort of good news, but they're actually not in this country. The labor force participation rate, people are falling back out of the labor force, which is a bad sign. Jobs in healthcare going up, jobs in hospitality going up, jobs in government going up, but jobs in manufacturing and industry are flat or declining. These are troublesome signs. It makes sense that there are increases in healthcare as we have fewer younger people, more old people. Jobs in healthcare are going to explode. Jobs in hospitality, restaurants, and the like, they're up, but we have economic problems. However, I want to put this in a larger context for you, because I think the story that we should be talking about that no one is talking about is that however weak our economy is, it actually is not only better than every other major economy in the world, but also we're outpacing China. Just a couple of years ago, in fact, a couple of years ago, for perspective, it was 2020, so 3 years ago. The Chinese were 77% of our gross domestic product. There has been this thinking for some time that China was on the rise, we were on the decline, and that they were going to crush us, that give it a few more years, and the Chinese would have the biggest economy on the planet. It was already at 77% of ours. Now, for perspective, if you go back to 2015, the Chinese economy was at 60% of ours. You want to get an idea of the rise? Go back to 2010. It was 40% of ours. 5 years later, it was 60% of ours. 3 years ago, it was 77% of ours. You know where it is today? 66%. The Chinese economy has collapsed as Xi Jinping, the president of China, has ended the market reforms in China and gone back to pure command and control communist style economics. They're collapsing. I have been saying for years on this program that China is actually on the decline, not on the rise. Don't bet against us. Certainly do not bet for the communists. Don't bet on China, because so much of China is a veneer. China puts up these great big buildings and they build these high-speed rail lines from Shanghai to Tibet, for example. You know what happens? They collapse. They fall over. There's a lot of economic turmoil. China has what's called shadow banks. Shadow banks are wealth management firms that lend outside of conventional banks. They have proliferated in China. The government has essentially turned a blind eye to lending institutions, microfinancing institutions, carrot guarantee firms, even pawnbrokers are on the business. You don't have to go to a traditional bank in China where it's very complicated to lend money in China through the traditional banking system. Conventional Chinese banks are owned by the state. Lending is heavily regulated. So you go to a third party that has less red tape and you get lending from them. You can't park money with them, but you can do loans with them. They're called shadow banks. It's a $3 trillion industry in China. You and I, when we want a loan, we don't go to a pawn shop typically. We go to a building and loan, we go to a credit union, we go to a bank, all of which have government regulation, but they're not owned by the government, so they're not burdensome with regulations. They just have a lot of oversight. They got to make sure they're not giving loans to people who shouldn't deserve them. In fact, in the past, we had credit crises in this country, like in 2008, because the government was incentivizing these institutions giving loans to people who had bad credit. In China, you go to the shadow banking system because there aren't as many red tapes and the oversight isn't as good. They don't have the regulatory system, and it's just a bunch of billionaires who float money. Well, they've been making bad loans. Shaanxi Enterprise Group, one of the largest wealth management firms in China, is now bankrupt. It faces $10 billion in losses for investors. Assets are being sold at a 70% discount. A criminal investigation has begun. This comes after Countrywide collapsed. Countrywide was a massive property developer in China, and starting in 2021, after COVID and lockdowns and everybody was forced in their homes, Country Garden became economically destabilized. And then there was the other one, Evergrande, as well. They became massively destabilized. They were apparently on sound economic footing, and then everything collapsed in on them. And a lot of the shadow banks had given them money, but not only them, a lot of local governments in China were giving these companies money. And the reason is simple. China engaged in market reforms in the 80s and 90s and in the early 2000s. But when Xi Jinping took over, he started pulling back on the market reforms. He started regulating more. And so these lenders started going to wealthy Chinese people who were still allowed to have businesses, where the government kind of turned a blind eye to them and making loans, and it got worse and worse. But the capital started fleeing. The banks in China started fleeing, the markets in China started fleeing to these other businesses, and some of these businesses had to go to local governments and offer them a lot of money in interest, and it's all collapsed. The house of cards has collapsed. China is in decline. They're not on the rise. Their economy has gone from being 77% our size to 66% our size, almost back to where it was in 2015. Why is this relevant to you? Some of you are listening and say, why do I care? Here's why you should care. Because the policymakers of the Republican and Democratic Party, the elite in Washington, in the academy and in the newsrooms of America, have presumed that China was on the rise and we were on the decline. So they have aligned public policy contemplating that our days are over and China's days are coming. Many of the wealthy and the elite in this country, bipartisan basis, have decided to cash in and cash out, and they made the same mistake the Democratic Party made. That demography was destiny. You look at China, you look at the intrinsic variables in China, you look at the population of China, you look at the rise of the middle class in China, and oh my gosh, demography is destiny. They're on the rise, and we're going to be on the decline. Our population is getting old. We're not reproducing as many people. We're a smaller country. They're going to survive and thrive, and we're not. We might as well get used to it. The Democrats did this with the Democratic Party, that as the country becomes less white, more black and brown, the Republican Party is going to be on the decline. And look what's happening. The Republican Party coalition is now an ever-increasing number of Hispanic and black voters in the Republican Party coalition. The Democrats are gentrifying white people, upper-income awfuls, affluent white female urban liberals. And as the affluent white female urban liberals, formerly the Karens, move into the Democratic Party, a lot of other people, they don't want to put up with these awful white women. They move out of the Democratic Party. The bossy white women of America move in with their bad haircuts and their masks on, demanding everyone else wear the mask and have an abortion on the side, and everybody else gets out of the Democratic Party. Demography was not destiny for the Democratic Party. The same holds true for China, but the same thinking of the elite in this country in both parties that said, well, the days of the Republican Party, they're in decline. And there were a lot of elite Republicans who thought that as well because of demography. They've thought the same thing with China. So many of our public policy bets in this country have been premised on the idea that China's on the rise, we're on the decline. You might as well cash in, cash out, get with the times. And it's not true. Never bet on communists. And the elite in this country always want to bet on communists. They always want to bet on command and control because they're always convinced that market forces are inferior to technocrats making the decisions. Both parties do this. The Democrats far worse than the Republican Party. Absolutely, at the upper echelons of the Republican Party, there are those who want to side with the technocrats. That's why some of them have been fixated on China. But it is the Democratic Party that is absolutely convinced that in Plato's Republic, we got to have all the academic technocrats making the decisions because the people aren't smart enough. And people are stupid, yes. But combined into a market force, they tend to make better decisions than the elite. The elite banked our future on being second place, and we're not, except they've been spending, and our national debt is as high as it is because they've been presuming our good times were coming to an end. Might as well cash out the system as much we can. And yet, if we can fix that national debt problem, we don't have to worry about China. The fundamentals of our economy aren't great, and they're still better than every other country on the planet, including China. We have time to turn it around. Never bet against the American people. And too many people in Washington have a habit of doing so. They bet on the rise of China. China's in decline. It's time to get with the program, bet on America, and get our economy fired on all cylinders and get Washington out of the way. The markets work better than Washington. The markets work. The reason China's in decline is because China stopped allowing market forces to work, which is what too many technocrats in Washington want to do as well. The lessons are there for all of us to see. We just got to get Washington to fall in line behind the American people instead of making the American people fall behind Washington, D.C.
Want to be